It's my pleasure to introduce the next speaker. Peter Natiello is a career member of the Senior Foreign Service with the rank of Career Minister, and he has served a distinguished career of more than 35 years with significant contributions to U.S. foreign policy, international development, peace building, civilian military coordination, public diplomacy, and humanitarian affairs. Mr. Natiello is a senior affiliate at the Solarium Group, a strategic advisory firm advising presidents and cabinet officials, four-star generals, ambassadors, governors, and ministers. He held some of the U.S. government's most critical leadership posts across Latin America, Africa, Afghanistan, multilateral institutions, and the U.S. Special Operations Command. Most recently, Mr. Natiello served as USAID's Senior Humanitarian and Development Counselor for the U.S. mission to the UN agencies in Rome. Prior to that, he was a Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean, and the USAID Mission Director in Afghanistan, El Salvador, and Colombia. Earlier in his career, he served in multiple positions with the USAID Bolivia, including Mission Director, and held a senior leadership role in South Sudan, Ecuador, and South Africa. Fluent in Spanish and proficient in Portuguese, Mr. Natiello began his public service as a Peace Corps volunteer in Ecuador and as a research analyst in the Inter-American Development Bank. He holds a master's degree in international affairs and from Columbia University, and a BA in political economy from Colorado College. Welcome, Mr. Natiello.
Thanks so much, Reese. Is this working? Yeah, great. Thanks. I really appreciate that. And I would love to be that guy. So thanks so much. Yeah, a quick story about my personal foray into the 3Ds. If on September 10th, 2001, you had told me, Natiello, in 8 years, USAID will assign you to a job in Tampa, Florida. I would have said, why Tampa, Florida? Like, I'm a USAID guy. I'm a development guy. Africa, yes. Latin America, yes. Middle East, yes. Asia, yes. But Tampa, Florida? If you had then said, yes, USAID will be sending you in 8 years to US SOCOM. I've heard a lot of acronyms in my time as a Foreign Service officer, but US SOCOM, what is that? Well, that's the United States Special Operations Command, you would have said. Special Operations Command, the home of the Navy SEALs, and like US Army Special Forces, Green Berets, Delta Force. Why on earth would I ever, as a USAID guy, somebody who wears Birkenstocks and carries an Economist magazine under my arm, what would I ever do in that world, right? And in fact, 8 years later, USAID sent me to the US Special Operations Command. And why did they do that? Well, they did it for a very serious reason. They did it because of 9/11, right? And 9/11 really, it changed all of our lives. I'm talking about the three of us here and our entire agency. It changed our families' lives, right? In many cases, we had to leave our families behind. And to a great extent, it reshaped the development work, and certainly our development work, putting it more directly at the service of our national security. The reason that 9/11 reshaped our development work and more closely aligned it with our national security is because our military leaders realized that they couldn't really kill and capture their way out of these very, very complex problems. They realized that we needed other tools in the national security toolkit besides just the military tool. They realized that our security challenge as the United States was no longer like state-on-state competition or warfare. They had this new enemy, this amorphous, hard to find, just very, very challenging, very, very difficult enemy. They had been trained in how to combat the Soviet Union, China, et cetera. And all of a sudden they're faced with a completely new threat stream. And they knew that to win, that we needed to understand this new enemy. Who were the terrorists? What was this phenomenon called terrorism? Where did they come from? Their languages, their communities, how were they radicalized? What were their economies like? What were their education systems like? What role did women play in families and communities and the radicalization process, et cetera, et cetera? And our military, these people are very, very smart, right? They're highly trained, highly educated. They know what they know, and they know what they don't know. And they knew that to those questions, they didn't have a whole lot of answers. So they stepped out of the Pentagon and they reached across the aisle to the diplomats at the State Department. They reached across the aisle to USAID, to development workers like me and Greg and Nancy. And they pulled us in. They brought us close. Because again, they knew that they needed us, and they needed us for this model, which has been referred to so many times. Of course, of this, I think. Anyway, hold that. They brought us into this 3D model of diplomacy, defense, and development, and it was smart. It was smart. And it was the reason that I was assigned to the Special Operations Command, right? Because at that point, USAID started to put some of its Foreign Service officers at military command so we could be part of this effort that was more complex than just a military challenge. And of course, it wasn't just me sitting in Tampa, Florida at the US Special Operations Command, right? It was so many people across USAID that served in places like Iraq, Afghanistan, et cetera. They would go to those places to work. Some would go to die. Again, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Yemen, Sudan, just to name a few. So that was my introduction, and that's how I got pulled in from a quiet life as a development worker into this much more purposeful effort around our national security. That was some 15, 16 years ago, I suppose. Let me just switch now to the 3Ds in Colombia. Are there any Colombians here this morning? No? Okay. Any folks been to Colombia? Okay. Great. Thanks. Good. You guys will keep me honest. Let's see. It's a map of Colombia. You could see sits at the northernmost point of South America. Its northernmost cities are about 1,000 miles from Florida. It's our neighbor. Geographically large country. You can fit 50 El Salvadors inside Colombia. Big it is. Geographically challenging. You can see from this map here on the right, you can see the 3 mountain ranges coming down from north to south. Country characterized by dense jungles, rugged coastal areas, specifically on that Pacific coast. Population of about 52 million people. This is the second largest country in South America after Brazil. The World Bank classifies Colombia as an upper middle income country. So it's a place that has achieved impressive levels of development. If you were to travel to its big cities, and some of you have, places like Bogotá, Medellín, Cali, Cartagena, Barranquilla. Somebody mentioned Bucaramanga this morning. That's another big, beautiful city in Colombia. You would find many of the same things that you find right here in Charleston, South Carolina. You would find brisk commerce, world-class universities. You would find a thriving and prosperous private sector, vibrant arts and cultural communities, impressive hotels, fantastic restaurants, strong public institutions. So So why is Colombia so important to the United States? Why should we care if it's reached that levels of development? Why should USAID care? Well, besides its proximity to the US, right? And besides the strong people-to-people connections, there are many Colombians living in the US, and there are many Americans living in Colombia. There's an important trade and commercial ties between our two countries. A free trade agreement that was signed in, I think, 2012 provides powerful economic win-win opportunities for both countries. We share a history of democratic values, including a belief in the rule of law, the defense of human rights, and the construction of strong institutions to defend those rights. Colombia is also a very, very important regional actor. So when we, the United States, have to address complex problems that cross borders, we want countries like Colombia who work by our side to address things like COVID, like managing migration, critical issue for the hemisphere, like addressing regional insecurity in places like Haiti, like addressing environmental challenges. A big chunk of the Amazon rainforest sits within Colombia's borders. So that environmental asset is something that we're interested in its health, right? And so we want strong partners to help us work around those kinds of challenges. But what really elevated Colombia in terms of a national security priority for the United States was its 50-year civil conflict between the state and a powerful leftist insurgent group known by its acronym, the FARC, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia. You see, in addition to this modern and economically prosperous, this economically prosperous Colombia that I just described a few minutes ago, we used to talk about two Colombias when I worked at USAID Colombia from 2012 to 2017. And in addition to that modern Colombia, let's see if I can get this to work. On your left, you've got that modern Colombia. And on your right, you've got what we called the other Colombia, or in Spanish, we called it La Colombia Profunda, the deep Colombia. And that other Colombia, remote, rural, isolated, characterized by its historic poverty, abandonment by the state, historic abandonment by the state, violence, it's home to terrible human rights violations, illegal economies, think trafficking in illegal narcotics, trafficking in persons, trafficking in arms, illegal mining. And that other Colombia, that's where the 52-year with the FARC was primarily fought. Not completely, some of it was fought in the cities as well, but it was primarily fought in that other Colombia. And a really important sidebar here, it wasn't just the FARC. The FARC was one of several armed groups that controlled territory in that other Colombia. There was also a very powerful and violent right-wing paramilitary group known as the AUC, the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia. And the AUC was associated with wealthy landowners that stood up their own private armies back in the 1980s and 1990s. Why did they stand up those armies? Because the Colombian state and the Colombian military failed to move in and defend those wealthy landowners from the FARC and from violence in those areas in that other Colombia. If you were an ordinary Colombian living in one of these places, in this other Colombia, your life was about survival. It was about staying quiet. It was about keeping your mouth shut. It was about keeping your head down. And because if you were seen as too close to the FARC, you became a target for the paramilitaries. And if you were seen as too close to the paramilitaries, you became a target for the FARC. So walking that line in those very, very difficult, violent places was a daily challenge for Colombians in that Colombia Profunda, that deep Colombia. Literally millions of Colombians living in that other Colombia and caught in the war's crossfire were displaced from their communities, often multiple times. Many moved to the cities, then they moved back. It was just a daily fight for survival. And Colombia has one of the had one of the highest rates of internally displaced persons in the world during that war. I'm oversimplifying here, but the FARC's origins were really based on the historic grievances of rural Colombians who wanted greater opportunity. They wanted paths out of poverty. They wanted stronger land tenure rights, government services, and justice. But the FARC, despite those roots, would eventually morph into a very powerful, a very well-funded drug trafficking organization that would stray from those ideological roots. It would use terror as a weapon, as one weapon in its military arsenal to topple a democratically elected state. The FARC was powerful. It brought the fight to the government. It used its drug money to buy arms and to buy off public institutions. For a time, it had the upper hand, so much so that about 25 years ago, when folks would talk about Colombia, particularly in the world that we from Solarium inhabit or inhabited, they would refer to Colombia as a near failed state. That kind of instability, that kind of violence, those illegal economies, the flow of drugs from the heart of the Western Hemisphere to US communities, it was anathema to US national security. So what happened? What was the response? The Colombians, for their part, tired of the war, they tired of the terror, they tired of the kidnapping, and they took action. In 2001, 2002, they elected a bold president willing to aggressively fight the FARC. Wealthy Colombians began to pay their taxes. And it's critical to have a revenue base if you want to build out your military capability to face off with these insurgents. And thousands of brave Colombians, military, police, ordinary citizens, paid the ultimate price, giving their lives in defense of their country against this insurgent group. That was in Colombia. What was happening in the United States? Well, the United States, again, realized this was anathema to US national security. So with the support of both political parties, Republicans and Democrats, and that's critical, and in close partnership and under Colombia's leadership, right? This wasn't the Americans saying, we're here, we're going to fix things. This was the Colombians saying, we need your help. And this was the Americans saying, we're here, right? The United States and Colombia developed something called Plan Colombia. It's a major and historic multi-billion-dollar effort to turn the tide of the war to the favor of the state, to end terrorism that had become such a tragic part of daily life, and to extend the presence of the state out to that other Colombia. Plan Colombia, I think, was noteworthy for several reasons. First and foremost, it recognized the complexity of Colombia's armed conflict. It realized this is not just a question of militarily defeating an insurgent group on the battlefield. There was a need to disrupt these illegal economies underpinning this insurgent group. There was a need to reduce the violence and the human rights violations that had destroyed communities around the country and destroyed trust in those communities, trust vis-a-vis the state, and trust vis-a-vis each other, right? Kawa talked a bit about how violence can really erode trust in his presentation last night. I thought that was excellent. And that was certainly happening in Colombia, although not as a result of an authoritarian regime, I should clarify. And Plan Colombia recognized, of course, the need to again, bring the state to that other Colombia. So Plan Colombia was a classic 3D approach. The United States government delegated the responsibility to implement Plan Colombia to the diplomats at the State Department, the soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines at the Department of Defense, and to development professionals at USAID. And here's what those three organizations did. The State Department brought America's diplomats to stand shoulder to shoulder with our ally, with the Colombian government and the Colombian people, to show our support for our neighbor and our close ally in its efforts to reestablish democratic stability. The State Department led on the development of Plan Colombia. It managed the bilateral relationship. It managed regional relationships with countries around Colombia, just to ensure that issues were proper, bilateral issues and regional issues were handled in such a way that they supported the achievement of the objectives of Plan Colombia. It negotiated treaties and agreements central to the effort. It represented the Plan Colombia enterprise to our Congress. And it ran programs to eradicate illegal drug crops and later to demine parts of the country. The Department of Defense did really three basic and critically important things. They trained the Colombian military. They helped professionalize and improve the performance of the Colombian military. They provided air assets, particularly helicopters, to pursue the FARC in remote corners of Colombia's expansive jungle canopy geography. And they provided powerful cutting-edge intelligence capabilities that helped the Colombian military find and fight the enemy. What about the third D? What about development? What about USAID? Let me see if I can. Quick photographs of the kind of things that we did. What about USAID? Well, as the military, the Colombian military took back territory from the FARC and from the AUC, that created space for the Colombian government, for the state, and for the private sector to move in to those newly retaken territories with state presence and with licit economic development and with social services. USAID was central to that effort. Again, we played a supporting role to the Colombian government. Here are some of the things we did. I'll quickly tick them off. We helped the government to reintegrate ex-combatants back into society as they came off the battlefield. We helped to rehabilitate child soldiers, some of the conflict's most desperate victims. We supported the National Protection Unit, which was charged with protecting social and political leaders, is charged with protecting them from assassination. We pushed out rapid impact community development projects just to help communities see the state, to see that the state was arriving, to see that the state was coming back, and to build confidence and trust in the state. We helped farmers return to their land and reactivate agricultural production because they weren't able to go to their land for decades because of the war, right? So we helped them go back to their land. We helped bring state-sponsored constitutional forms of justice to these areas, helped improve roads, connectivity, and basic infrastructure. And we even partnered with Colombian banks at one point to help them move in to the other Colombia with financial services, $1 billion worth of financial services, not your taxpayer money. This is Colombian capital from Colombian banks who saw a market opportunity as this other Colombia started to open up, right? Our job was to provide relatively low-cost U.S. Treasury-backed guarantees that enabled those banks to move in to that other Colombia and share the risk with them, because these are risky places to lend money, right? The 3Ds, we worked together, the State Department, Department of Defense, USAID, we worked together under the leadership of the ambassador and in close partnership with Colombia, with its government, with its military, its private sector, certainly. And in the case of USAID, in its far-flung communities, like the communities that we saw in the previous slide, and like this Afro-Colombian woman who is working on her coffee there, those were the places where we would go to. Colombians would often say to me, "You know more about my country than I know," because people weren't allowed to leave their cities, et cetera. They were afraid to go out, right? But that wasn't our case. At USAID, that's where we wanted to be. That's where our work was. That's where the need was, right? What was the outcome of this effort? It was pretty positive. Military successes improved security. They reduced the massive displacement of Colombians from their communities. Security made the country safer for citizens and commerce to move around. Greater security led to major increases in domestic and foreign investment in Colombia in the early years of Plan Colombia. Increased investment contributed directly to really significant gains in GDP and in job growth. And then in 2012, after this back and forth military conflict, and after the Colombian military executed, frankly, a very successful string of complex operations against the FARC saw the writing on the wall and they said, "Let's talk peace." And so they agreed to sit down across the table from the Colombian government in Havana, Cuba, and they spent 4 years hammering out a peace agreement with the government. The peace agreement was ratified. It was signed in 2016. It was ratified in 2017 by the Colombian Congress. Between 13,000 and 14,000 FARC combatants laid down their arms and walked off the battlefield. Government began a major rural development and land reform push into the other Colombia to address the historic grievances that gave birth to the FARC back in the mid-1960s. The Colombian government knew that, hey, if we can't attend to our own people, then we can't expect, peace in that other Colombia, right? We need to attend to these historic grievances. As a result of the peace agreement, the Colombian government established a truth commission to look into just the terrible violence and the plight of the country's millions of victims from the war. They set up a transitional justice system to handle crimes committed during the war by the FARC and by the Colombian military. I think that's very important. And I think it's fair to say that the 3D approach in this particular case was helping to change the game. It was showing tangible and frankly historic results. As the contours of the peace agreement became clear, we at USAID refocused our programs to support implementation of the different chapters of the peace agreement, support reparations to millions of conflict victims, not with our money, but with Colombia's money, support land reform. We supported, again, helping the Colombian private sector to reduce the risks of moving into that other Colombia. We advocated for, and I'm particularly proud of this, we advocated for and successfully advocated for, and we supported the implementation of the final chapter of the peace agreement. And it's a chapter called the ethnic chapter, and it's focused on supporting Afro-Colombians and indigenous peoples. Why? Because Afro-Colombians and indigenous were disproportionately and most affected by the Colombian conflict. Now, admittedly, and despite these successes, many urban Colombians didn't favor an agreement with the FARC and were mistrustful of the peace agreement. Rural Colombians, however, in that other Colombia, they had suffered the brunt of the conflict, and they welcomed it. What did we spend on all this? Well, we spent from about 2000 to probably to about 2017 when I left the country. We spent about $10 billion for the 3Ds. And while this sounds like a lot of, a whole lot of money, $10 billion, it's really small relative to what we spent in places like Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, again, in terms of value for money to the taxpayer, if I could put it in those gross terms, forgive me for that, I think this was probably a pretty good investment, again, relative to the Afghanistans, where we spent close to $1 trillion, and the Iraqs, where not sure how much we spent, but it was a lot more than 10 billion. What's happened since the agreement was signed? Because I want to be fair about this. This is not a perfect picture. It never is. In 2018, Colombia, a year after the agreement was signed, actually probably 9 months after the agreement was signed, Colombians elected a center-right government that, while not particularly supportive of the peace agreement, they generally continued its implementation, initially pushing forward on some of the key rural development investments and even protecting the Truth Commission and the transitional justice system. The murder of social leaders increased significantly in the years following the signing of the peace agreement as drug trafficking organizations fought for control of the corridors that they used to move drugs out of the country, okay? When the FARC stepped away from the battlefield, they controlled the drug business. It left a huge vacuum, and all of a sudden, these little drug bands start to pop up to control that business, and innocent social leaders get killed in the midst of that. Tragedy. Let's see. Coca cultivation, the raw material for cocaine, skyrockets after the accords were signed. The threat morphed. Some FARC dissidents, those who did not lay down their arms, there were probably 800 to 1,000 that did not lay down their arms. They stayed out on the battlefield, they stayed engaged in the drug business, and they continue to be a serious problem for the government, the country, and the hemisphere. President Petro, current president, is elected in 2022. He came into office and he said, I'm now going to negotiate peace with all the other armed groups in our country. He called it paz total, total peace. The idea was, we got the FARC, now let's get the other guys to come off the battlefield. Hasn't worked. The University of Notre Dame's Kroc Institute. This is a fascinating organization that monitors the implementation of peace accords around the world. Pat Murphy and I had an interesting conversation. Pat's a former Notre Dame faculty. We talked earlier this morning. But the UN and the Colombian government said to the Kroc Institute, we want you to monitor this peace agreement. And we want you to tell us how we're doing. And I'll just read you the summary line from the latest report from the Kroc Institute on the implementation of the Colombia's peace accord. The Kroc Institute says, the agreement is a qualified success in ending the FARC as an insurgent army, but a struggling effort in building a stable and lasting peace. They argue that the current president's total peace, paz total policy, needs to be incorporated into the 2016 agreement, which is a good agreement. So you see the mixed, reviews there from Notre Dame, from the professionals there on the Colombian peace agreement. Very quickly, in terms of lessons, Colombia's own ownership of the problem and leadership was absolutely central to this. David Kramer yesterday talked about the South American development miracle, South Korean development miracle, forgive me. I think you can say the same thing about that. South Korea is a development miracle because the South Koreans own their development problems and they found a way through it with some development support from us and from others. So Colombia ownership and leadership was critical. Bipartisan political support through 4 US presidential administrations was absolutely essential for the staying power and the continuity of Plan Colombia. Plans are important, right? But as my Marine Corps friend likes to tell me, no plan survives first engagement, or as Mike Tyson once said, everybody's got a plan until they get punched in the face, right? So plans are important, but I think more important than plans is the process of planning together. And the Americans and the Colombians sat together, we worked together, we built this really special relationship through Plan Colombia that endures even today, when relations between our two countries, we got a little tense there over the course of the past few months. I'll leave it at that. Yeah, and finally, signing an agreement is one thing, right? It took 4 years. It took a lot of fighting to get to it. It took 4 years to negotiate it. But actually implementing the agreement to address these root causes that I talked about in the other Colombia, that's really the long-term challenge, and that remains a long-term challenge, and that requires continued work with the development tool. Where's the 3D approach going? And I'm going to wrap up here because I may have gone over. Forgive me, Max. Despite the changes we've seen to U.S. national security and U.S. foreign policy over the course of the past year with the Trump administration, as people have said throughout this conference, these problems are not going to go away. They're complex, extraordinarily complex, and addressing them requires smart and judicious use of diplomatic, defense, and development tools, among others. In whatever shape the development tool takes, that's all under construction right now. And we'll hear from Nancy in a few minutes on some ideas that she has on how to reconstruct that tool. My only point is that you got to have it. It's got to be in the mix. It's got to be in the toolkit. Venezuela was talked about a lot in Greg's presentation. I mean, that's kind of a fascinating little look at this, right? You get the U.S. government completely relying on the first D, defense, sending aircraft carriers and all kinds of military assets to the Caribbean. At what cost? I don't know. I haven't added that up, but I'm going to call my congressman and ask, because that was a pretty expensive push, right? Less emphasis in Venezuela on the diplomatic D, and really no emphasis yet on the development D. As Greg suggested, Venezuela is going to need a development D. It has a historic reconstruction challenge facing it. And the United States, I think, would be well served by being able to respond to that in whatever form, but just be a good partner in helping Venezuela to rebuild should the conditions permit it. It's clear that many in Congress recognize the importance of the 3Ds, the need to reactivate the Development D, as do emerging civil society groups in our country and ordinary citizens, as well as certainly very highly visible media people. I don't know if you read Nick Kristof in the New York Times, if you read Atul Gawande in the New Yorker, they're all talking about just the terrible human impacts of the destruction of the Development D. And they're calling out from their positions of their powerful positions in civil society to say we need to reconstruct this. Colombia shows us that under the right conditions, the 3Ds can advance U.S. interests. And we'll have to watch the space going forward to see how the tool is reconstructed. Thanks for your time this morning. Thanks for your attention. And thanks for having us. It's really been wonderful to be here.
Peter, thank you so much for these remarks. We have a couple of microphones here. If you have a question, please raise your hand. Questions from students?
Thank you. This is a question from a former student. I was in grad school during Plan Colombia at UT Austin, and many of my colleagues were Colombian, and they've now returned to Colombia, to Bogota, to Barranquilla, and other parts of the country, and taken on leadership roles. So I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the role of education and U.S. Colombian exchanges within the 3Ds.
Yeah, I really love that question. In terms of dollars, USA didn't spend a whole lot on that. But in terms of impact, I thought we had enormous impact. And I'll just give you one example. We had an agreement with a consortium of 3 US universities, with University of Florida, University of Minnesota, and the third one escapes me. It wasn't UT. And it was an effort to strengthen Colombian law schools' human rights curricula, right? And so we, helped to bring down law professors from the United States. They would spend a semester or an entire year at Colombian universities just to teach human rights law to Colombian lawyers. Classic example of like long-term development impact, right? Because those young students are going to go on to be lawyers and leaders in their country, and they're going to be aware of just how important it is to defend human rights in a place like the place we just talked about, right? The other thing I love about those university to university partnerships is that they're enduring. Once the professors start to meet each other, once the students go here and go there, and they start to, work together, and then USAID steps away, the US universities often say, this is a great effort, and we need to continue this with our own funds. And I've seen that many times throughout my career with USAID. It's just an extraordinarily powerful and fairly low cost and long-term sustainable way to help strengthen a country's development. Thanks for that question.
Thank you so much for that great presentation. I just wanted to ask what the U.S.'s involvement in Colombia looks like today, especially with this administration's kind of new focus on drugs and organized crime, as well as migration to our country.
Yeah, it's a great question. Of course, I can't speak for the administration. I don't work for them. But what I can say is that the relationship remains very strong. In spite of the public spat between our 2 presidents, they seem to have made amends a week or 2 ago when the president of Colombia visited our president in the White House. But here's what I could say about that. Like below that theatrical level of the 2 presidents and the media, the relationship continues very tight at a working kind of technical level. When I worked in Washington at the Latin America Bureau, I participated in a couple of what were called high-level dialogues between the U.S. and Colombia, our 2 governments. And I participated in them after President Petro, this left wing, he's a former insurgent himself, the guy who's the current president. I participated in those dialogues when he was president, right? And he would often have a very kind of, very like anti-Western, anti-American narrative. But when I would sit across the table from my Colombian counterparts and watch the interplay between the Americans and the Colombians at those dialogues, I was just stunned by how like we were talking each other's language. We had dealt with the same problems, even though the president was, he had his own narrative and his own script, which he's entitled to because he was elected by the Colombian people. I don't begrudge him any of it. But I was just stunned by how this relationship was just super tight. So we continue to work together on issues like migration. We continue to work together on issues like the drug problem. I think that from the Americans' side, I think we have relied, from my personal opinion, too much on the defense D in terms of firing missiles at ships coming across the Caribbean, maybe with drugs, maybe not. There's no due process, so we don't really know what's on those ships, right, on those boats. Tight relationship at the working level still, trying to make amends at the top level. But again, I feel pretty positive about our relationship with Colombia as we move forward. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. A question from an ex-student or an eternal student, I would say. I'm really interested in to what extent the Colombian negotiation process is relevant for the current negotiation between PKK and Turkey. Because in the literature, you see a lot of references to this, and not necessarily the 3Ds, but the first D of diplomacy. Based on your experience, how relevant, what lessons could be learned from the Colombian case for should negotiations work out in Turkey? That's a big question mark, but for the first time, there are some good hopes that may succeed. Thank you.
Thanks, Kawa, for that question. I'm not as familiar as I should be with the Turkey PKK negotiations, but here's what I could say. Every country has its own context, and every peace agreement unfolds in its own context. It was a little bit comic. USAID, after I finished in Colombia a few years later, they needed somebody in Kabul in Afghanistan when they were just beginning to talk about a possible peace agreement, right? And so they said, get that Natiello guy. He was out in Colombia, send him over to Kabul. Well, I learned in about 8 hours that I parachuted into a completely different place with a completely different set of circumstances. But some Afghan friends of mine traveled to Colombia to talk to the peace negotiators to hear that story. And when I asked my Kabul friends, my Afghan friends, the Tolo News guys, right? When I asked them, I said, well, was this helpful to go across the world and look at that experience? And they said, oh, it was extraordinarily helpful. They said it's a completely different country with a completely different history, et cetera. But just the fact that the FARC and the Colombian government were able to sit down and talk peace gives us hope in Afghanistan, right? Afghanistan came out a different way. But so that caught my attention, right? And the other thing I'll say about the Colombian peace accords is that I think people that looked hard at them, like outside experts, and probably Notre Dame and the Kroc Institute, I think they would tell you that those peace accords were pretty well constructed, pretty well thought through, pretty well planned by the Colombian government side. So those guys went to the table with a smart peace proposal that, after 4 years of hard negotiations, they got to it, right? But that spending time on the engineering of the agreement is a critical thing, and it has to address the other side's concerns, right? It's not a surrender, right? Yeah. How are we doing? Oh, yeah.
Hello, thank you. That was a very interesting presentation. I have a question regarding Colombia's mercenary population. They have one of the largest mercenary populations out of any country, and I was wondering if that was a sort of a byproduct of the over-reliance, like you said, on the D defense, and or that was a product of the instability and the fall of FARC and everything like that with the...
That's a fascinating question, Rees. And I don't have a good answer. All I can tell you is that it's a byproduct of the fact that those guys have a skill. I'm not making a judgment on their skill, you know, but it's a skill. They have lethal skills, right? That they picked up from extensive training with our own military. And they have taken that to other places. I don't know the size of, it's interesting to hear you say that it's a large population. I remember when the Haitian president was murdered, I want to say in summer of 2021. And they talked about Colombian mercenaries being part of that, that event. These people take this out, they're clearly taking it out to other places to sell those services. And I think Colombia's not proud of that. And I think the Colombian government was shocked at what happened in Haiti. I don't know about other places. I think I even saw something about them being in Ukraine recently. Yeah. So, yeah, I wish I could tell you more about that. That's a sidebar that I'm not as informed on as I should be. Thanks.
And a former student. So in Colombia, in these areas that are very rural and in the mountains, I think we all know that the beginning of prosperity is education and then having a trade. So I believe that many Colombians don't even speak what we think of as Spanish, but they speak indigenous languages. I'm wondering about the literacy rate there in those rural areas, as well as did the government after the, the ending of the insurgency, did they put any kind of educational system in these rural areas, and have they set up trades, agricultural, craft trades, things like that, and empowerment of women in those areas?
Yeah, so that was, those things were absolutely part of this, one of the chapters of the peace accord was rural development. And it was precisely because the literacy rates and social indicators in those parts of Colombia were so far below what they are in the modern Colombia, that both sides, the FARC and the government, said we need to push out and invest in the rural areas of our country. We have to do that. And again, in 2018, when the administration of President Ivan Duque came into power, they remained committed to that. And they had programs to push out investment into rural areas. That has since waned, right? And it's waned at their peril. Like, you can't ignore those problems, right? Because if you do, you're either going to pay by investing in your people when they're kids in school, or you're going to pay later on in their lives when you have to reintegrate them back into society when they've come off the battlefield. There's no way around it, right? That was kind of my lesson from Colombia. So the peace accord commits to that. I would say the response was tepid in terms of implementing those kinds of things, as the Kroc Institute says. And I would say that Colombia needs to continue to stay very, very focused on that. Our challenge as USAID, we figured out very quickly, you remember those pictures of the modern Colombia and the war-ravaged Colombia? How do we connect those? They don't need America to come in and tell them what to do. They have those things in Bogota. They have smart people. They have brilliant people, right? They have powerful businesses. They have market linkages. They have everything you need in that modern Colombia. How do you connect to the other Colombia? Yeah, okay, thanks.